The $100 bill hit the marble floor of the 40th floor boardroom and skidded to a stop an inch from a scuffed pair of work boots. 12 executives sat frozen around the glass table. Vanessa Whitmore stood at its head in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's rent. Her manicured finger still extended from where she'd just flicked the bill from her wallet like she was tipping a valet. "Pick it up," she said, not raising her voice, because she never had to. "That's more than you make in a day, I'd imagine." The man in the gray coveralls, a laminated badge reading maintenance clipped crooked to his chest, didn't move. He'd been kneeling by the HVAC panel in the 5 minutes earlier, quietly resetting a breaker that had been tripping all week when Vanessa had swept in for her 10 a.m. and decided he'd make a useful example for the room. Something about the way the other executives fidgeted around her calmed him. He'd seen boardrooms like this before. He'd built a few of them. He looked down at the bill, then back up at her. "Keep your $100, he said, quiet, almost gentle. The kind of voice you'd use to tell someone their shoe was untied. Your $100 million empire is already dead." Nobody breathed. Somewhere behind Vanessa, a junior analyst's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth, tilted, and a thin dark line ran down the back of her hand onto the table without her noticing. "Excuse me?" Vanessa said. "Q3 receivables," the man said, standing now, brushing dust from his knees with the unhurried calm of someone reading off a grocery list. "Somebody in this building has been booking revenue that doesn't exist. Phantom invoices to a shell distributor in Ohio that shares a mailing address with your VP of sales brother-in-law. You've got 48 hours before your auditors catch it themselves, and about 90 before your bank calls the loan." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick enough to touch. "Who let him in here?" someone finally muttered. "I fixed your air conditioning," the man said. "Nobody let me anywhere. I noticed." To find out how a man in maintenance coveralls knew more about Vanessa Whitmore's $100 million company than the 12 executives paid to run it, and what it would cost both of them before the truth finally settled. Stay until the very end. 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the badge, not the coveralls, not the quiet. Carter Hayes had been something else entirely. A turnaround consultant so sought after that he's waited 8 months for a slot on his calendar. The kind of man who walked into failing businesses and, within 90 days, could tell you exactly where the money was leaking and exactly who was lying about it. He'd built his name rescuing 3 companies from the edge of bankruptcy before he turned 35, and the 4th one made him briefly, uncomfortably famous. A cover story, a keynote circuit, offers from firms that wanted to put his face on their letterhead. Then his wife Danielle got sick. It happened fast, the way the worst things do. 11 months from diagnosis to the funeral. 11 months during which Carter turned down every contract, canceled every flight, and sat in hospital rooms, holding her hand, while his phone buzzed itself dark in his pocket. Their daughter Lily was 5. She didn't understand why Mommy stopped coming home, only that she needed her father to be there when she asked. And Carter had made a promise to himself in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning that he would never again be the kind of father who wasn't in the room. So when Danielle died, he didn't go back to consulting. Consulting meant airports, red eyes, 90-hour weeks, nannies raising his daughter over video calls. He took a maintenance job at Whitmore Dynamics instead, a company he'd once turned down as a client, because their leadership had struck him as arrogant, because the hours were fixed. The pay was steady, and he could be home by 5 every single day to make Lily's dinner and check her spelling homework at the kitchen table. Nobody at Whitmore Dynamics knew who he'd been. He'd made sure of that. A man who once advised boards now emptied their trash cans and reset their breakers, and he'd decided quietly that the trade was worth it. Whitmore Dynamics itself was a mid-sized industrial manufacturer that Vanessa Whitmore had inherited from her father 4 years earlier, and had spent every day since trying to prove she deserved. The company was in the middle of closing a $100 million acquisition deal with a much larger conglomerate, a deal that would either cement her as one of the youngest self-made titans in the industry or confirm every whisper that she'd only ever gotten this far on her father's name. 1,200 employees, 3 factories, a board that watched her every decision like hawks, circling a rabbit that had wandered too far from the burrow. Vanessa was brilliant, exacting, and lonely in the specific way that comes from having spent a decade proving herself to men who'd already decided what they thought of her before she opened her mouth. She trusted numbers, because numbers didn't have opinions about whether a woman belonged at the head of the table. Unfortunately for her, the numbers she trusted most were the ones her CFO, Marcus Cole, had spent the last 18 months quietly poisoning. Marcus was polished in the particular way of men who'd learned early that charm could substitute for competence if deployed correctly. He'd been with Whitmore Dynamics for 9 years, survived 2 rounds of layoffs, and positioned himself as Vanessa's most trusted advisor, the one who explained the spreadsheets to her in the language of confidence rather than caution. What none of the board knew, and what Vanessa certainly didn't, was that Marcus had spent those 18 months manufacturing revenue to keep his numbers looking clean enough to survive 1 more quarter, 1 more bonus cycle, 1 more chance to fix the hole before anyone noticed it had become a canyon. If you've ever watched someone in a position of real power make a wrong call about who deserved to be trusted in the room, you already know how this story starts. Tell us in the comments if you've seen it happen. The person underestimated turning out to be the only one who actually understood what was going on. The acquisition was set to close in 6 weeks. Whitmore Dynamics' fate, and the jobs of 1,200 people who had no idea any of this was happening above their heads, rested on numbers that were, quietly and steadily, lies. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in front of 11 other executives, and it started the way most humiliations do: small, deniable, and entirely preventable if anyone had bothered to ask a single follow-up question. Carter had noticed the discrepancy 3 weeks earlier, almost by accident. He'd been called up to the 40th floor to fix a jammed printer near the finance department, and while he waited for a part, he'd glanced. The way he glanced at everything, the way 20 years of pattern recognition never quite turned itself off, at a stack of invoices left open on a nearby desk. Something about the vendor name snagged in his memory: Cole Distribution Partners. He'd seen it before, months earlier, on a delivery slip that didn't match any shipment the warehouse logs showed leaving the building. He hadn't gone looking for it. He wasn't trying to be anyone's hero. But once he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it, and over the following weeks, in stolen minutes between work orders, he'd pieced together enough to know exactly what he was looking at. Revenue booked against a distributor that didn't distribute anything. Invoices approved by a signature that traced back, eventually, to Marcus Cole. He almost said nothing. That was the old promise talking, the one that told him this wasn't his fight anymore, that his fight now was homework and packed lunches, and being the kind of steady his daughter could set her clock by. But 1,200 people worked in this building, and Carter knew, the way he'd known it in every company he'd ever turned around, that when fraud like this collapsed, it was never the Marcus Coles of the world who lost their jobs first. He tried the quiet route first. He left an anonymous note in the internal compliance Dropbox, spare and factual, no name attached. It disappeared into a system that, as it turned out, Marcus had quietly influenced 2 years earlier when he'd gotten his own cousin installed as head of internal audit. Nothing happened. The note vanished like it had never existed. So when Vanessa Whitmore swept into the boardroom that Tuesday for a routine facilities check-in, annoyed that a maintenance worker was still crouched by her HVAC panel during a meeting she'd specifically asked to be undisturbed for, and made the mistake of asking him, with a raised eyebrow and a room full of witnesses, whether he understood what he was even looking at, Carter made a decision he would spend the next several weeks wondering if he regretted. "I understand it fine," he said. "Better than the person who signed off on the cold distribution invoices, probably." The room went cold in a different way than it had a moment ago. Vanessa didn't know the name. That was the detail that would haunt her later, that a man in coveralls had said it out loud in front of her CFO, and she hadn't even recognized it as a threat, because to her it was gibberish, a stranger's attempt to sound important in front of people who mattered. Marcus recovered faster than anyone in the room. "Vanessa, I think our facilities contractor is a little confused about what he's looking at," he said, smooth as poured concrete. And the laugh that followed from 2 of the junior VPs was the kind of laugh that exists purely to signal loyalty. "Maybe we let him get back to the air conditioning." That was when Vanessa reached for the $100 bill. not out of cruelty exactly, though it would look that way later, and she would not be able to argue otherwise, but out of the specific, brittle embarrassment of a woman who had spent a decade being told she let the wrong people get too comfortable around her, and who wanted, badly, in front of 11 witnesses, to reassert that this was still her room. "Pick it up," she said. "That's more than you make in a day, I'd imagine." And Carter told her the truth instead. The 48-hour deadline he gave her that morning was not a threat. It was a fact, delivered the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, flatly, because softening it would only cost her time she didn't have. He told her which invoices to pull. He told her which bank covenant would trigger first. Then, because human resources had already been summoned by someone in the room who assumed the maintenance man had lost his mind or his job security, Carter was walked out of the building by security less than an hour later, his badge deactivated before he'd even made it to the parking garage, while Marcus Cole stood at the 40th floor window watching him go with an expression that, if anyone had been looking closely enough, would have read less like relief and more like fear. Carter didn't argue. He didn't call a lawyer. He drove home, made Lily's dinner, and sat with her at the kitchen table while she read him her spelling words. And if his hands were a little unsteady doing the dishes that night, she didn't notice, because he never let her see the weight he carried alone. He hadn't told anyone at Whitmore Dynamics who he used to be. He wasn't about to start now. Walked out and humiliated, with nothing to gain from it but the satisfaction of being right in a room that had already decided he was invisible. If you've ever been the person everyone in the room decided didn't matter, right before you turned out to be the only one who actually knew what was happening, tell us about it below. So many people watching this have lived some version of that exact moment. 48 hours would pass, quietly, ordinarily, while Carter went back to interviewing for maintenance jobs at other buildings, and while, 40 floors above him, everything he'd predicted began, one line item at a time, to come true. The first crack in Vanessa Whitmore's certainty didn't come from an auditor. It came from a Sunday morning she spent alone in her office with 3 years of coal distribution invoices spread across her desk, because a small, insistent voice she couldn't quite silence kept asking her why a maintenance technician had known a vendor name that even her own CFO's assistant had struggled to pull up on request. She found the first inconsistency in an hour. The shipping address matched a strip mall mailbox store 2 states away. The signature on 6 consecutive approvals belonged, technically, to a junior accountant who'd left the company 14 months earlier, meaning someone had kept using a departed employee's credentials to push invoices through a system nobody double-checked, because nobody had reason to. By the time she found the 3rd, 4th, 5th inconsistency, her coffee had gone cold and her hands, for the first time in longer than she could remember, were not entirely steady. She thought about calling Marcus. She picked up the phone twice and put it down twice, because some old, uncomfortable instinct told her that the person who should explain a fraud was never the person who benefited most from it going unnoticed. Instead, she called Priya Anand, a sharp young financial analyst 2 levels below Marcus who had a reputation, mostly unspoken, mostly unrewarded, for asking the kind of granular questions that made senior leadership uncomfortable in meetings. Priya had noticed the same discrepancies 8 months earlier, and had raised them once, carefully, in a memo that had gone nowhere, after which she'd learned to keep her observations to herself if she wanted to survive another review cycle. "I need you to pull everything you have," Vanessa told her. Everything you were too scared to send up the chain. It took Priya 11 minutes to send a folder that made Vanessa's stomach drop through the floor. 18 months of manufactured revenue. A shell company registered to an address that, when Vanessa finally cross-referenced it out of some grim curiosity, belonged to Marcus Cole's brother-in-law. Nearly $9 million in phantom receivables sitting on the books that the acquisition's due diligence team would find within the week. The moment they looked past the summary numbers Marcus had been feeding them personally. Somewhere in the middle of reading it, Vanessa realized she was going to have to find the man she'd humiliated in front of her entire executive team and ask him, somehow, to help her clean up a mess she now understood he'd tried to warn her about for free. It took her 2 days to track down Carter Hayes. H had no forwarding information beyond an address that turned out to be an old apartment he'd moved out of a year earlier. She found him eventually through the maintenance staffing agency that had placed him at Whitmore Dynamics. A woman named Rosa who ran the agency's front desk and who, after a long pause and a longer look at Vanessa Bez's business card, said only, "You're the one who threw money at him." Vanessa didn't deny it. She found Carter on a Thursday evening in the small ranch house he shared with Lily, standing at the edge of his driveway, watering a row of tomato plants while his daughter did cartwheels on the lawn behind him. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked, if anything, tired in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with having watched this exact kind of reckoning happen inside other companies, from the inside, more times than he could count. "I can offer you your old position back," Vanessa said, which even to her own ears sounded absurd the moment it left her mouth, given that his old position had been emptying trash cans. "Better. A director role, whatever title you want. I looked into your history, Mr. Hayes. I know who you used to be." "I don't want a title," Carter said, turning off the hose. "I want you to fix internal audit so the next person who finds something like this doesn't get walked out of the building for it. I want the 1,200 people who work for you to still have jobs in 6 weeks. That's it. That's the whole ask." It was, Vanessa would think later, the least self-interested response anyone had given her in a decade of asking people what they wanted. She hadn't expected the second crisis to arrive so fast. 2 days after that conversation, with Carter quietly reviewing the fraud documentation from his kitchen table late into the night, the acquisition's lead due diligence partner called an emergency meeting, not to flag Marcus Cole's fraud, which they hadn't found yet, but to announce that a competing conglomerate had made a surprise counteroffer for Whitmore Dynamics that would collapse the current deal entirely, unless Vanessa could produce clean, verified financials within 5 business days, a deadline that made the 48 hours Carter had originally given her look generous by comparison. There's an old argument that never quite settles, in companies like this one, whether the people who kept quiet about what they saw, out of fear for their own jobs, share the blame for how bad it got before anyone spoke up, or whether silence was simply the only rational choice available to people with nothing close to Marcus Cole's protection. Priya had stayed quiet for 8 months. Carter had stayed quiet, in his own way, until the day he wasn't asked to be. 8 months would pass, in the version of this story where nobody had asked the right question at the right time. Vanessa Whitmore did not have 8 months. She had 5 days, one furious CFO who didn't yet know he'd been caught, and one former turnaround consultant standing in a driveway asking for nothing but the truth. Carter walked back into Whitmore Dynamics on a Monday morning, not through the loading dock this time, but through the front lobby, in a gray suit instead of coveralls, carrying a single folder instead of a toolbox. Vanessa had reinstated his access herself, personally, overriding 3 layers of HR protocol to do it, and had told exactly 2 people why he was there, Priya and no one else, because she'd learned, the hard way, exactly how far word traveled in this building when the wrong person heard it first. He worked the way he always had, quietly, methodically, without asking for credit or announcing his findings, until he had something airtight. Within 36 hours, he'd traced the full architecture of the fraud. 18 months of fabricated shipments, a rotating cast of dormant vendor accounts, and a pattern of quarter-end journal entries that only made sense if you understood exactly how badly Marcus Cole had needed his numbers to look clean for one more earnings call, one more bonus, one more chance to unwind the hole before anyone noticed. What made Carter dangerous wasn't just that he found the fraud. It was that he could explain, in language the board would actually understand, exactly how a company with 3 factories and 1,200 employees could keep functioning, keep shipping product, keep making payroll, while $9 million of its receivables were fiction, because he'd built companies like this from the ground floor and torn apart companies just like it from the outside. And there was no version of the story Marcus could tell that Carter hadn't already heard from someone smarter, trying the same thing a decade earlier. Marcus felt it happening before he understood why. Meetings he used to run alone now had Carter quietly present in the corner, saying almost nothing, asking one precise question near the end that would leave Marcus recalculating his answer 3 different ways, before he found one that didn't contradict something he'd said the week before. By Wednesday, Marcus had stopped returning Vanessa's calls promptly. By Thursday, he'd hired a lawyer. The unraveling happened in the boardroom, the same room, though this time Vanessa had made sure every relevant executive was present and every phone was in a basket by the door. Carter didn't raise his voice. He laid out 18 months of transactions on the screen behind him, month by month, showing exactly where the shell company's invoices had been approved using the login credentials of an employee who'd left the company over a year earlier. Credentials that, it turned out, only 3 people in the building had access to reactivate. Marcus Cole was one of them. "I want to be very clear," Carter said, in the same even voice he'd used the day Vanessa threw the $100 bill at his feet, "that I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm here because in 5 days, this company either produces financials that hold up under a due diligence review, or 1,200 people lose their jobs for a lie they had nothing to do with. Whoever did this can fix it faster than I can prove it, if they choose to." Marcus didn't confess, not then. He stood, said something about needing to review his own records before making accusations against him, and left the room with the particular stiffness of a man doing everything in his power not to run. He was gone by that evening, not fired yet, technically, but absent, his office cleared out overnight, his company laptop wiped remotely before IT could preserve it as evidence, which told everyone in the building everything they needed to know, even before Priya found the backup server logs 3 days later that made the wipe irrelevant. It had all been recorded elsewhere, quietly, the way Carter had suspected it might be, because men like Marcus Cole rarely covered their tracks as thoroughly as they believed they had. Vanessa found Carter alone in the boardroom that night, the lights dimmed, the folder of evidence squared neatly at the center of the table, like he'd already moved on to thinking about something else. "You could have let it collapse," she said. "After what I did to you in this exact room, you could have let all of it fall apart and told yourself I deserved it." "I thought about it," Carter admitted, which was as close as he'd ever come, in front of her, to acknowledging how much that Tuesday had actually cost him. "Then I thought about the 1,200 people who had nothing to do with what happened to me, and it stopped being a hard decision." Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, looking at him the way she hadn't let herself look at anyone in longer than she wanted to admit, not as a subordinate, not as a resource, but as a person who had absorbed her worst instinct and answered it with something close to grace. "I judged you the moment I saw you kneeling by that HVAC panel," she said. "I decided who you were before you said a single word. Most people do," Carter said. "I stopped holding it against them a long time ago. It's easier that way." 1 month would pass before the due diligence review closed, before the board learned the full shape of what had almost happened to their $100 million deal, and before Vanessa Whitmore had to decide, in front of every person who'd laughed along with Marcus Cole that Tuesday morning, exactly how she planned to make this right. The board meeting where the truth came out publicly was, in its way, the mirror image of the one that had started everything. Same room, same glass table, same 12 executives, minus one empty chair where Marcus Cole should have been sitting, now facing a federal investigation that would eventually end with restitution orders and a suspended license, though none of that had happened yet on this particular morning. Vanessa stood at the head of the table and, before presenting a single slide of the recovered financials, said something none of them expected. 6 weeks ago, in this room, I threw $100 on the floor and told a man to pick it up, because I decided, without asking him a single question, that he wasn't worth listening to. That man is the reason this company still exists. I want that on the record before anything else I say today." She'd asked Carter to be there. He stood at the back of the room, in the same gray suit, and said nothing, because he'd never needed the room's approval to know what he'd done was right. But he watched Vanessa do something that surprised him more than anything in the last 6 weeks had. She took the blame publicly, completely, without qualifying it or softening it for an audience that would have let her. The deal closed 9 days later at full value, with clean financials and a restructured internal audit division that reported, per Carter's one non-negotiable request, directly to the board rather than through the CFO's office. Meaning the next Priya Anand who noticed something wrong would never again watch her memo disappear into a drawer. Vanessa offered Carter the largest signing bonus her board had ever approved for an executive hire, along with a title, Chief Restructuring Officer, his choice of scope, his choice of team. He turned all of it down, the way she'd half expected he would by then. "I don't want the corner office," he told her. In the same driveway where this had all really started, Lily's cartwheels replaced now by a game of catch she was badly losing against a soccer ball. "Put the bonus into a whistleblower protection fund. Something with teeth this time. Not a Dropbox nobody checks. And give Priya Anand the audit director role. She earned it 8 months before either of us showed up." Vanessa did both, within the week. What she offered him instead, 3 weeks later, over coffee that had gone cold on his kitchen table, while they talked longer than either of them had planned to, wasn't a job at all. It was dinner. Just dinner, she said, nothing that needed a title. The quiet coda came 2 months after that, on an ordinary Saturday, no cameras, no board, no witnesses except an 8-year-old who had appointed herself the family's official judge of new people, and had, after careful deliberation, decided that Vanessa was allowed to stay for pancakes. Vanessa stood in Carter's small kitchen, flour on her sleeve from a recipe Lily was narrating with total authority, and found herself thinking that this exact unremarkable Saturday felt more like the thing she'd spent her whole career chasing than any deal she'd ever closed. On the counter beside the stove sat a single, folded $100 bill, the same one which Carter had kept and never spent, not out of resentment, but as a reminder, his own quiet symbol, of the day someone had decided his worth before he'd said a word, and how wrong that decision had been. If there's someone in your own life who got written off before anyone bothered to actually see them, a parent, a coworker, someone who went quiet instead of arguing their own worth, we'd love to hear about them, and about what it finally took for the people around them to notice. If stories like this one, about the people we underestimate until we can't anymore, are ones you want to keep finding here, we'd be glad to have you stay. Carter Hayes never went back to boardrooms full-time. He didn't need to. He'd already proven, long before that Tuesday morning, the only thing that had ever actually mattered to him, that being underestimated costs you nothing, as long as you know exactly who you are when nobody else in the room does.